It is, again, the story that never ends. And a lot of this is going to build off of what I was speaking to you about collectively probably 2 weeks ago now, when I went over the history of the American government and its involvement with the Vatican. And this goes back at least to World War II, probably to the interwar years as well. But the preface to that was World War I, when Pope Benedict XV tried to intervene to end World War I, or at the very least, to broker a temporary peace for Christmas. And he was roundly ignored by the world powers. By World War II, the mutual interests of the United States government and the Catholic Church seemed, at least temporarily, to make them odd bedfellows, but at the very least, they felt there was common cause against what was going on, mutual threats and everything else. So if you accept the official narrative of those events, it would make sense that the two institutions would work together. And then it would make sense in the Cold War years for the two institutions to continue to work together. But it comes at a price, especially as that mutual involvement gets deeper and deeper. An example of this is the open admission by the US government, and hinted at by figures like Malachi Martin and others in their writings, and even admitted to a certain degree by the Vatican, that US government's intel agencies and the Vatican would help each other during the Cold War. Priests sometimes operating on the other side of the Iron Curtain, gathering information, bringing it back to Rome, and the Vatican allowing that information to go to the US government. That's extremely dangerous as a precedent to set. And when the Cold War ended, to no one's great surprise, that relationship did not end. And amidst all of this, it's large amounts of money. After World War II, we got what gets commonly called the Vatican Bank. And practically since its inception, it has been the locus of controversy. If you read Malachi Martin's work, Vatican, which, by the way, had been out of print, but now you can get copies brand new on Amazon, I highly recommend you do so. The book Vatican is back in print, and I always tell people read that before you read Windswept House. And part of what Vatican is about is the Vatican Bank. He goes over all of the crises surrounding it since its inception. At the heart of everything, it seems, is money. And the Vatican Bank was accused often of being the place where world powers would come to make sure their money was squeaky clean when they were using it for purposes their constituents might object to, for their rather larger geopolitical goals. Again, read Vatican. It's the prelude to Windswept House, and you will see some familiar names in that book. Once you get past it's a faction, just like Windswept House. The names in it were changed, but they're not exactly that hard to figure out who they are. Like half of the book follows the Polish Pope. Hard to figure out who that is. And it's a perfect setup for Windswept House. And it makes everything you're going to hear now make sense, because that book is mostly about the problems of the Vatican Bank and geopolitical forces trying to influence the church, which is exactly what we have going on here. Before we get into that, I want to give you your daily Francis update. And Bree Dale, semi-independent Catholic journalist, shared this video of Francis's doctors speaking in English. You hear a lot of rumors right now that he's going to resign. Another cardinal came out and said that's nonsense. So here is the doctors for your update on Francis's health, and then we're going to go into the issue of the day, which is a demand for an investigation into the deep connections of our government and the Vatican.
Okay, so very short answer, because I can't make a summary for everything we said before. The Pope is fine. The reason that we are here, because it's 1 week that he's in hospital, and so he asked to us, myself and Dr. Luigi Carbone, to give you some information. Of course, he has in critical condition. That means that one patient of 88 years old with chronic lung disease, and you have some infection, virus, mycetes, and bacteria. Is critical condition, but he's fine now. He's fine. We hope that And we are working every day with Mr. Strappetti, Dr. Luigi Carbone, or other my colleague, as I told before, Professor Carlo Torti, Professor Luigi Richeldi, Professor Antonio Gasbarini, etc. All the medicine, all the drugs that he needs to recover. But of course, he's old, he's some chronic disease. But we are really in charge, as we do with all other patients in this hospital. They receive the same medication, the same colleague that work with them. There is no different with others. Just a very short. The humor, you wanted I can give you the joke? No, the humor is always the same. You mean Holy Pope or Holy Son? You say, good morning, Holy Pope, good morning, Holy Son. And you say, you understand that he's fine, he's more clever than you. So the humor is perfect.
And I show you that because there has been a weird circulation now of who's Papabile, who's going to be the next pope, which is ghoulish and premature. So let's just focus on what we have. There's a lot of weird rumors. That's why I wanted to show you that video directly from the source. So that all having been said, when we're talking about financial problems in the Vatican, we're talking about the influence of Caesar, the government of the preeminent world mega power, and its relationship. And suddenly, you get a new crew in Washington who comes in and says, this is unsustainable. We are burying ourselves financially. And what we're doing is often unethical and causing us more problems than it's worth. And so they start reforming things. You may not like those reforms. You may be wildly supportive of them, like I am. But this is causing the U.S. bishops to lose their minds. They just lost it completely. And we have a channel member using their monthly free super chat to say, please pray for my family as we lay Sister Veronica to rest today. 10 a.m. funeral, burial at Convent Cemetery at 4 p.m. Yes, please pray for her family and for the repose of the soul of Veronica, please. But it's worth noting, when we're talking about these financial issues, it's the love of money that is the root of all evil. And when you start getting Caesar offering his coins to the church to do the bidding of Caesar that looks like it has overlap with the church, there's an old concept from public administration, where when you're talking about nonprofit organizations, and they were always worried about taking money from one of two sources, government or business, because they would always come with strings attached. That would inevitably lead to what's called mission creep. And what is mission creep in the nonprofit world? It means that you're changing the mission of your organization from whatever it was you founded it to become more inclusive of other things, to then drift the mission away from its actual intended purpose to some other area. And if you need an example of that, the Catholic Church and its corporal works of mercy organs are a perfect example of that. Because now you have U.S. bishops so wholly dependent on Caesar and his dirty coins that, as you're about to hear from Liz Yore, an estimation that it's like 80% of their liquid financial assets come from Caesar. How we got there is anybody's guess, but it looks like it began at least in the run-up to World War II. Now, I gave you that as your introduction. LifeSite published their open letter with the headline, "Did Obama officials force Pope Benedict's resignation? Open letter calls for Trump investigation." What they're not asking the U.S. government to do is to investigate the Vatican. The U.S. government has no authority to investigate the Vatican. What it does have the authority to do is to investigate what it was agents of the United States government were doing involving the Vatican. That is the focus here. There are people who think that that the president is going to somehow send Doge to the Vatican to start going through the Vatican archives or something. That's not going to happen. The U.S. government doesn't have that authority to do it. This open letter is asking for an investigation into what the U.S. government has been doing. Here is the open letter written by Elizabeth Yore, John Henry Weston, Michael Matt, and David L. Saunier. Shortly after the first inauguration of President Trump in 2017, an open letter was published in the Remnant newspaper requesting an investigation into potential involvement by the Obama administration in the affairs of the Catholic Church. Specifically, the authors asked whether the U.S. government was involved in the sequence of events that resulted in the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI on February 11, 2013, and the conclave that elected Pope Francis on March 13, 2013. This open letter was widely circulated throughout the world, but no action was taken during the first Trump administration. Consequently, the questions that were raised remain unanswered. Questions in the open letter include the following: to what end was the National Security Agency monitoring the conclave that elected Pope Francis? What other covert ops were carried out by the U.S. government operatives concerning the resignation of Pope Benedict or the conclave that elected Pope Francis? Did the U.S. government operatives have contact with the Cardinal Daniil's group? And we'll talk about that more in a minute. International monetary transactions with the Vatican were suspended during the last few days prior to the resignation of Pope Benedict. Were any U.S. government agencies involved in this? For those who don't know, the banks and the ATMs in Vatican City and anything associated with the church in Rome, they just stopped working completely. Almost as if like somebody flipped a switch and shut off their access to funds. Kind of saw that later on in Canada too, by the way. You remember what the truck drivers were all up to? Hey, we saw something similar to that. Why were international monetary transactions resumed on February 12th, 2013, the day after Benedict XVI announced his resignation? Was this pure coincidence? What actions, if any, were actually taken by Big John P., Hillary C., and others tied to the Obama administration who were involved in the discussion proposing the fomenting of a Catholic spring? What was the purpose and nature of the secret meeting between Vice President Joe Biden and Pope Benedict XVI at the Vatican on or about June 3rd, 2011? Nearly 2 full years before he resigned. What roles were played by Big George S. and other international financiers who may be currently resided in U.S. territory? These are also the kinds of questions you could use to build a Freedom of Information Act request to get information from the U.S. government. You just may get a lot of redacted, blacked out documents, or you may be given mountains upon mountains of documents, or you may get nothing at all. We wish to draw attention once again to this letter with the hope that the questions it contains will be answered. The second Trump administration shows itself willing to get to the bottom of difficult issues, so we believe that an in-depth investigation is now possible. To be clear, we are not asking for an investigation of the church. However strange the behavior of the current pope may be, and however much his agenda seems to align itself with that of the wealthy and the powerful, man I call Satan Claus, along with George S. and the American Democratic Party, it is not our position to investigate the Pope and the bishops he has appointed. We are asking for an investigation into the affairs of our own government. It is not unprecedented for a corrupt government to attempt to insert itself into the life of the church. There are numerous cases of this throughout history. It is certain that a government in which 51 intel officials would lie to the American people to steer a political contest is not above attempting to steer a conclave. It is equally certain that a government obsessed with advancing the confusion of the flesh themes and the sacrifice to Moloch on demand would not be above meddling with a conclave if doing so could help somehow advance their program. Several news outlets reported that various Vatican offices were electronically surveilled by U.S. intel agencies, both before and during the 2013 conclave. If these allegations are true, the consequences of monitoring the conclave are significant. One of those consequences would be that the whole thing was compromised. We believe it to be the responsibility of loyal and informed U.S. Catholics to petition our government to authorize an investigation into these critical questions. Catholics throughout the world expect this of us. This open letter will be followed up with a request of declassification of general categories of documents and release of the same under the Freedom of Information Act. It must be restated that we're not requesting an investigation into the Catholic Church. Rather, we are simply asking for an investigation into activities of a previous Obama-Biden administration, when they fomented various removals of states and color revolutions to remove governments around the world. Did the same administration force the resignation of a pope so that a prelate favorable to their program could be installed as pontiff? Thank you again, and be assured of our most sincere prayers. Respectfully, the people I named above. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what they're asking. And this might happen. I'm not saying it will. I'd be pretty sure this is going to come pretty far down the priorities list. But this could happen simply because if you're wanting to destroy the old, remember, part of my thesis is that we are experiencing one of those great turnings in history. If you want to destroy the old power paradigm, one way to do it would be to show where their grotesque overreach was and how they completely misused, in the most horrifying way possible, the levers of power. And so you show them every instance of that, and this would absolutely be one of those. And if they would do this to the Catholic Church, would they do this to Missouri Lutheran Synod? Would they do this to the Mormons? Would they do this to the other competing religions out in the world and their leadership? Now, Archbishop Vigano gave an interview. He published it on his website. It's too long to go into, but I synthesized the answers he gave essentially to all of this into one kind of long quote from him. And I will show that to you here so you can understand what Vigano is going to say, because Vigano will have his typical kind of hot take on this. And here's what he has to say. He says, like everything that comes out of Bergoglio's mouth, talking here about migration, these accusations against the Trump government are false and delusional. There is no large-scale removal occurring. Rather, there is a precise, focused decision to put an end to the floods of unregulated immigrants that previous administrations had planned, favored, and encouraged. In fact, removal occurred in the opposite direction during the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations, including a priori targeted international cooperation projects to help populations in need in their respective countries of origin, instead of focusing every effort, even when it was against the law, to increase the plan of basically substituting people. Those who are now tearing their garments do so only because their lucrative business has been put to an end, and that's addressed to the U.S. bishops. They have shamefully profited from this forced thing, which has made possible by the network of international organizations and, well, bad guys on an international scale that manage the movement of people illicitly. Bergoglio's letter is a jumble of falsehoods and deceptions. It betrays the panic of the mercenaries and the anger of the financiers. Bergoglio has gone so far as to invent a new doctrine, imposing as a moral duty the reception of immigrants, from whose management he obtains billions in public funding and through which he accredits himself as the main interlocutor of the worldwide elite and the executor of the woke program. By the way, when it comes to that number that I threw out earlier, 80%, it comes from the interview Liz Yord did with, I can't remember who it was, seen a lot of those things recently. I had about 100 of you send me that in a few days. Go watch it. She throws out the number 80% of the church's funding coming from the U.S. government. And we're going to go over some other things on this here, when we do what looks like I'm pivoting to a different topic, but it's all related. Bergoglio, exploits the teachings of Pius XII, decontextualizing and distorting his words, because by quoting a pope not suspected of modernist or conciliar contamination, he hopes to gain the attention and support of those faithful who do not listen to him. We need to understand Bergoglio's fraudulent operation. He wants to take the conflict between the immigrationist, woke, embedded church and the Trump admin to the next level, dogmatizing the duty to welcomeize illicit arrivals and those forcing American Catholics to see Trump as an enemy of the Catholic Church. And that is exactly what he is doing. On the more basic level, there is a partisan politics angle to this. It is more of old regime that is now being completely ignored by most people and trying to get them back by simply trying to get Catholics to turn against the guy in the White House right now. In short, he is trying, according to his characteristic modus operandi, to turn President Trump into an adversary in order to undermine his support from Catholic voters. The dishonest operation also serves to put back at the center of the American political and social debate an episcopate that has been widely discredited due to the sins of the flesh and financial scandals that have so far seen it totally subservient to the establishment of the Democratic Party. The real clash is between Trump's political conservatism, the Make America Great Again, with which the majority of Americans, including Catholics, identify, and the ultra-progressivism of the Bergoglian embedded church. I would caution you to think that most Americans do identify with Trump's sort of the ideology underlying the Make America Great Again thing. I'm not saying they don't. Don't oversell it. Americans were really, really angry at the last government, and they seem to be very happy with things happening now, but don't oversell it. Don't oversell it. American Catholics, however, have seen through the fraud, while Bergoglio, in obedience to his handlers, hurls anathemas against those who build walls. President Trump has announced, among other measures that we welcome with deep satisfaction, the return of the U.S. to the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which defends the right to life for all, reaffirms the importance of the family, and affirms that there is no international right to the sacrifice to Moloch. The magisterium of the Bergoglian Church is totally self-referential. Bergoglio practically only cites himself, and when he cites documents from Vatican II and post-conciliar popes, it is only so he can surpass them. Seeing Pius XII cited by Bergoglio should therefore arouse a more than legitimate suspicion, confirmed in fact also by quick reading of Exsul Familia. The apostolic zeal of Pope Pius XII, as well as his predecessors, is not limited to a mere indication of the need to welcome floods of the new arrivals, but focuses first and foremost on the care of the souls of Catholics who have been forced to migrate due to famine, war, and religious persecution. Even if the great economic migrations of the 19th and 20th centuries were driven by the same international lobbies, moving populations from the south of Europe to the north or from Europe to the Americas, we cannot forget that the historical context of the post-war period was very different from the current one. First of all, because the Catholic Church was not, nor could she have ever been, an ally and accomplice of the stonecutters. She was rather a firm and outrageous protector of the poor and the weak. Secondly, because today the attack on our civilization is much more violent and open than it was at the end of the Second World War. Pius XII wrote in Exsul Familia, Holy Mother Church, impelled by her ardent love of souls and impatient to fulfill her duties inherent in her mandate of salvation for all mankind, a mandate entrusted to her by Christ, she has been especially careful to provide all possible spiritual care for pilgrims, the arrivals, exiles, and migrants of every kind. This work has been carried out chiefly by priests who, in administering the sacraments and preaching the word of God, have labored zealously to strengthen the faith of those Christians and to deepen the bonds of charity. Let's interject here. The church's teaching on this, is what Vigano is saying, has been that the church should have the right to care for, first and foremost, the spiritual needs of migrants and also to do the corporal works of mercy for them. And this is where he deviates even from some of the better American bishops who also say we need to change the laws and anybody who comes fleeing from bad economies needs to be welcomed in. Those are the better ones like Naumann. Watch that interview on The World Over this morning before coming on this. Pius XII is talking first and foremost about the spiritual well-being of them. And if you care about their spiritual well-being, you do not under any circumstances want them coming to the United States of America, because we know that something like half of them leave the Catholic Church for some other option, including atheism, within a short time of them being welcomed to the country. Don't believe me? Go look at the number of Spanish language Protestant houses of prayer and concerts you see in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And when you see that, it's the arrivals going there. That's who's going. The very last thing that Bergoglio ever pursues is the defense of the integrity of the faith or the salvation of souls. Nor does he really care about the poor. Just look at how many homeless people are camped around the Vatican and under Bernini's colonnade. Back in the era of the 2020 affliction, in order to get a meal, they had to show that they had received the solution. The ugly bronze boat erected in St. Peter's Square is a monument to Bergoglio's hypocrisy. For him, the poor and the marginalized are a mere tool to crossbreed both the social and ecclesial fabric, that is, to dissolve it, and thus obtain the definitive cancellation of what remains of Christian society after decades of secularization. Bergoglio thinks big. He wants to create the premises of the new religion of humanity, deluding himself that he can preside over it and thus carve out a role for himself in the new order that will emerge from it. As a prophet of syncretistic, ecological, and inclusive worldwide ideology, Bergoglio even made an appearance at the San Remo Festival to launch John Lennon's song Imagine, the stonecutter manifesto of their way of running things. The Apostolic Constitution of Pope Pius XII is a totally opposite tenor to this horizontal vision, as is the entire Catholic magisterium compared to the Bergoglio one. In Exsul Familia, Pius XII recalls the trade in those in involuntary servitude at the hands of the usurers in America. And he mentions the dangers to which the people of Mexico were exposed when fleeing the anti-clerical and stonecutter revolution, having become the prey of the enemies of Christ. Bergoglio's attitude towards persecuted Christians is quite different. The secret agreement made with the regime of Beijing, he has handed over Catholics in China to face their end, and he remains silent on the violations of their fundamental human rights. In Bergoglio's dystopian vision, anti-human, anti-Christian, and anti-Christic, our nations are lands set apart for the conquest by the new arrivals in Europe, the followers of the crescent moon. This is the purpose of conciliar ecumenism. According to their unholy book, anywhere their call for prayer and where the carpet is spread is their territory. The connivance of the Bergoglian clergy, who host their priests in our churches and allow such prayer in the parvises of our cathedrals, constitutes a betrayal of Christ and of the faithful. Regulated immigration, in which there is true integration and in which the Catholic Church is committed to converting pagans to the true faith, is the last thing Bergoglio wants. The purpose of this is not to help the dispossessed and the poor, but rather to import poverty, social chaos, and domestic conflict into our cities. And if the worldwide integration ideology supports Bergoglio, it is because he is one of its emissaries, obedient to the orders given to him. What we are witnessing is, in fact, a migration that is forced, which impoverishes the nations of origin of so many men and young people who could be making their own government strong and their own nations prosperous. Instead, they are transformed into those who break the law, put into voluntary servitude, and victims of the vile movement of people done by those who are just grotesque or even subject to the removal of their own parts for profit. Hundreds of thousands of the most young disappear into thin air every year, with the complicities of those who pervert Christian charity in the culpable counterfeiting of welcoming in order to make a profit. That is Vigano. And where is he wrong? Okay? Everything he says lines up with what you just heard from Liz Yore, Michael Matt, and John Henry Weston, and the other person whose name escapes me at the moment. Nothing he said there is wrong. Now, one of the questions that Liz Yore asked in her letter was about Cardinal Daniels, whether the St. Gallen group, the Lavender group, as you have to be careful with the kind of things you say sometimes on these platforms. They asked if the U.S. government worked with him. Let me take you back into the Wayback Machine here. This is from the Wild Voice. I'll have all my sources linked at returntotradition.org after this broadcast so you can check all this for yourself. See, the Cardinal confesses to this criminal or club against Pope Benedict XVI and for Jorge Bergoglio. September 24th, 2015, journalist and Vatican insider Edward Penton, who is not a radical by any stretch, released the article below in the National Catholic Register titled Cardinal Daniels admits to being part of a secretive group opposed to Benedict XVI. We hope you'll take the time to read the article below in full. Let's go over this so you understand. Because it really does look like that Cardinal Daniels, who admitted fully he was seen on the loggia when Francis was first introduced as the Pope. Cardinal Daniels was a radical's radical, and he admitted in a bragging kind of way some months after the conclave that he and his friends broke the rules of the conclave to get Jorge Mario Bergoglio made Pope. Violated John Paul II's document governing the rules of the conclave. That's how Francis non-canonically became the Pope, is that they gamed it. He admitted it on camera. What Edward Penton had to say almost 10 years ago on this? Further serious concerns are being raised about Cardinal Godfrey Daniels, one of the papal delegates chosen to attend the upcoming Ordinary Synod on the family, after the Archbishop Emeritus of Brussels confessed this week to being part of a radical reformist group opposed to Benedict XVI. It was also revealed this week that he once wrote a letter to the Belgian government favoring the James Martin parody of holy matrimony and their legislation because it ended discrimination against the James Martin groups. The cardinal is already known for having once advised the King of Belgium to sign a law on the sacrifice of Moloch in 1990, for telling a victim of the Ted McCarrick problem to keep quiet, and for refusing to forbid the most impure, disgusting educational materials, quote unquote, being used in Belgian Catholic schools. He also once said the James Martin parody of holy matrimony was a positive development, although he has sought to distinguish such a union from the Church's understanding of matrimony. According to a forthcoming authorized biography on the Cardinal co-written by Jurgen Metpinigen, a former spokesman for Cardinal Daniel's successor, Archbishop André Joseph Leonard, and Karim Shelkins, a church historian and theologian, the Cardinal expressed satisfaction over the disappearance of discrimination against the James Martin types after legislation was passed approving that parody of holy matrimony in 2003. The authors of the biography, to be published September 29th, revealed that the Cardinal wrote a letter on May 28th, 2003, to then Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt, who at that time was putting together his second government. In the letter, the Cardinal wrote favorably about, quote, one of the last achievements of Verhofstadt's first governments, the approval of a legal statute for stable relationship between partners of the types that James Martin is most interested in. Verhofstadt government introduced their legal parody into Belgium in 2003. Let's pause here. The problem that you're seeing being rooted out in the U.S. government right now is about NGOs. And what are NGOs? They are an informal link between one government and another. in addition, of course, to their nonprofit status. There are plenty of NGOs that operate widely in Europe who receive money from the US government and Europe. And the highest level people in the major NGOs have enormous influence in the church and in these governments. Guy Verhofstadt was actually later on a very major figure in the European Union. Okay, after 2003, he was a major figure in the European Union. Don't underestimate Daniil's direct connection to this. Under Verhofstadt's leadership from 1999 to 2007, the Belgian government not only introduced the James Martin parody, but also laws on mercifully removing people from this mortal coil, experiments on the truly most vulnerable, and of course, IVF. Despite the poor record of the Belgian government resisting these laws and the country being far smaller than many African countries that have one delegate representing them, Cardinal Daniil's 82 will be one of 3 Belgian prelates to attend the synod in October. The Vatican listed him second in importance out of 45 delegates personally chosen by Pope Francis to participate in the upcoming meeting. In other words, this is a person from a country where they will be sending 3 delegates, even though there are delegates that were coming to that synod from Africa. They had many more Catholics there, but we're only sending 1 delegate. For some reason, they sent not only 3 delegates from Belgium, but also they made sure to send Cardinal Daniil's. At the launch of the book in Brussels this week, the cardinal said he was part of a secret club of cardinals opposed to Pope Benedict XVI. He used a word for a criminal organization to describe them that bore the name St. Gallen. It's where the St. Gallen language comes from, as him. The group wanted a drastic reform of the church to make it much more modern, for Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio to head it. The group, which also comprised Cardinal Walter Casper and the late Jesuit Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, has been documented in Austin Ivre's biography of Pope Francis, the Great Reformer. And again, I tell people to read the first edition of that book if you can find a copy, because the later editions are pared down drastically because they let way too much out in that first edition. But the fingerprints are there. They're all over the place. And, with all this talk of, there's talk now, some cardinals trying to get Francis to resign. Hey, man, it's not going to resign. Come on. And all this talk of conclaves and things. The only thing I will tell you is, do you think that the successors to Cardinal Daniil's are going to let this just go? Cardinal Daniil's group has been meeting again in St. Gallen. I've reported on it before. Once Francis started having these kind of regular health issues, they started having meetings again. They were very tight-lipped about what it was, but they're getting ready and have been for a long time. The best way you can counteract that is there's some material action that can be done to the College of Cardinals report that was done by an organization. That helps. But prayer and fasting is a way to help. Damon Keller, thank you for the super chat. He has to say, Sister Lucia said that communism would spread to every nation. Vatican City is a nation and not excluded. Our Lady of Fatima book by Thomas Walsh, 1946. Yes. People act like that's something far off in the future. I think we've been living under that for 30 years, honestly. Just because private property is still a thing people think they have doesn't mean that you're not thinking like a hammer and sickle follower. But that's not where all this ends. You see, the U.S. bishops and their mess, you may have heard, I mentioned in passing that the U.S. bishops had their lawsuit against Trump thrown out. Let's go over that. Because it looks like the new administration wants to toss out all the money, toss out all the lifeblood for this crooked way of manipulating things. And the Vatican clearly objects. And I've said if there is a conclave sometime soon, this whole issue will loom large over it. Here is from the USCCB. USCCB files lawsuit on unlawful suspensions of U.S. refugee admissions program, dated February 19th. It didn't take long for the government for the courts to respond. For decades, the USCCB has partnered with the U.S. government and locally based Catholic partners to help nearly 1 million individuals find safety and build their lives in the United States. Build their lives. Permanent was their goal. The unilateral and unexplained decision of the government to suspend this program will have devastating impacts on refugees, making it harder for them to establish themselves in their new home. Again, the USCCB was trying to be permanent about this. Why? Now, many of them have convinced themselves it's their Christian duty. You see this in their letters. But when you really look at those flowcharts that you can now find on datarepublican.com, when you start using their search engines to see how grants flow, it's not just U.S. government directly giving to them. It's money from other nonprofits who got their money from government or from very shady billionaires. Now, the U.S. bishops filed their lawsuit. We go to the Washington Times for this. With this headline, Catholic bishops lose first round to Trump in court battle over refugee money. When was this dated? The 20th. Like that. One day gone. Just no. Now, this says first round, though, so this issue is clearly not over. This website has got so many pop-ups, it's actually annoying. But let's take a look, see if we can make sense out of it. A federal judge on Thursday rejected the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' request to turn back on the spigot of federal money the government formerly paid outside groups to help settle refugees. President Trump halted the money as part of a broader push to rein in the program and international assistance spending. The Catholic bishops had called the administration's pause illegal and asked the federal court in Washington to issue a temporary restraining order that would restart the money. U.S. District Judge Trevor McFadden declined. The court finds that the plaintiffs had not made the requisite showing and will thus deny plaintiff motion to the extent that it requires a temporary restraining order, he said in a brief order. He did, however, set a speedy schedule for the bishops to argue for a preliminary injunction, which is a more powerful court remedy. USCCB filed the lawsuit on Tuesday, saying it and affiliated Catholic organizations throughout the country were assisting some 6,700 refugees when the funding pause hit. The bishops said they have to dig deeper into their own pockets to make up the difference to continue their work for those refugees. The USCCB is one of a number of non-governmental organizations that the federal government has contracted with to help resettle them in U.S. communities. USCCB said the funding should not hurt its reputation as well as the well-being of the refugees. Refugees who have already entered the United States may soon be cut off from support, contravening the statutorily expressed will of Congress, making it more difficult for them to establish themselves as productive members of society, the bishops ordered in their court filing. They said the government assistance doesn't cover all the costs of the refugee services, and the USCCB and its affiliates spend their own money too, but they said the federal funds are critical. And you get the idea. It's nonsense, of course, but if you want to talk a little bit about how much money we're talking about here, how much are we actually talking about? Well, let's go here to complicit clergy who spent some time putting the numbers together. The headline, Federal Catholic Immigration Funding. It's worse than we thought. Published yesterday at complicitclergy.com. Every time people dig into these numbers, the amount of money that the bishops receive keeps going up and up and up. After publishing our original analysis of federal immigration funding of Catholic NGOs, on January 24th, we were alerted to a number of NGOs we missed in our original analysis. Under the Biden administration, Catholic NGOs were awarded nearly $3.2 billion in immigration funding. That's more than quadruple the level of funding under Trump's first administration and more than double the amount awarded under the Obama administration over the course of 8 years. Since 2009, Catholic NGOs have pocketed nearly $5.6 billion in federal immigration funding. Please keep this in mind that this figure is likely understated due to the facts that, one, our analysis only includes federal programs that are clearly associated with immigration. NGOs are likely using funds from non-immigration related programs to serve the migrant community. Our analysis does not include state funding programs, such as the money being provided to Catholic University Seton Hall, which offers legal services to them. Our analysis does not include non-Catholic organizations. We saw evidence of state agencies sharing their funding with Catholic NGOs without specifically making a subaward to these organizations. While we did our best to include all Catholic NGOs in our analysis, we undoubtedly missed some Catholic organizations which lack Catholic identifying characteristics in their name. It should come as no surprise that Catholic Charities has been the top recipient of this federal funding, with their network of NGOs harvesting nearly $2.9 billion of federal funding for immigration-related services. We should also not be surprised to learn that the illustrious United States Conference of Catholic Bishops came in second place, reaping over $1.6 billion. So here's their little chart. 2009 to 2024, Catholic Charities, $2.8 billion. USCCB, $1.6 billion. Miscellaneous, $852 million. Jesuit Refugee Service, $131 million. Caritas, $42.5 million. And Diocesan, $11 million. For a grand total of $5.535 billion from 2009 to 2024. Looking at the individual recipients by the unique entity identifier, the USCCB comes out on top, followed by Catholic Charities of Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth, the same bishop who was crushing nuns in his diocese trying to get their land, to the point where he drove the Arlington Carmelite nuns to disaffiliate themselves with the establishment and essentially become part of, sort of, the SSPX, meaning they're sacraments from the Society of St. Pius X. Take a look at this. Catholic awards by recipient, the USCCB, basically 1.5 billion. Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Fort Worth, just that diocese, $1 billion. And it goes on and on and on, and these are all Catholic organizations. Another view of the data is to break down the catalog of federal domestic assistance, which tracks the type of assistance provided for each the federal grant. The top 3 programs provided funding to Catholic NGOs are, well, refugee and entrant assistance, the unaccompanied minors, and of course, U.S. Refugee Assistance Program. Boom, 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 boom. It's all there. Catholic awards by your category. If you find this issue particularly compelling for you, go take a look at this complicit clergy article. I will have it linked in the show notes at returntotradition.org minutes after the live stream is over. Perhaps most disturbing is the amount of money being awarded through the unaccompanied minor program. Since 2009, Catholic NGOs have received nearly $1 billion to process the most young who don't have an adult with them. 350,000 of them are missing. The last number I heard from Tom Homan is that they found like 40,000 of their location of 40,000 of them. I hope that number has gone up since then, since that has been since about a week after the new administration took office. It is unfathomable how our federal government has allowed Catholic NGOs to process so many of them, given the U.S. bishop's horrific record in hiding away the most horrible things being done to the most young. This is the McCarrick problem. Remember, by the way, Ted McCarrick looms large over this issue too, because Ted McCarrick had this weird habit of being photographed with American presidents. Obama, Bush. He raised millions upon millions of dollars for the Papal Foundation by going to elite wealthy Catholics to support the programs of the Holy Father. He would often travel with envelopes of cash to grease the skids of things as he was moving around, meeting with and hobnobbing with political people. If the word asset comes to mind, that's a good word to describe Uncle Ted. And they have a complete immigration funding analysis that they have a hyperlink to. They encourage people to read it. There's a good reason for that. Final thing here. This is an older article, but as they say, it's an older one, but it checks out. So we go here to LifeSite from an article they published almost 5 years ago. This is another source of funding that we'll never get the information on unless we get it from the Vatican itself. Headline from LifeSite. Why a whistleblower from China may be right that the communists paid Vatican to shut up about its war on Catholics. This is a billionaire who left that country. He claims the Vatican was bribed into silence. Thursday, June 25th, 2020. Rome was a pretty busy place at that time, and this story got lost in the weeds. He claims that the party allocates up to $2 billion a year to buy the Vatican's silence concerning the ongoing persecution of the Catholic Church in that country and other abuses of their fundamental rights as human beings. He made the allegation without offering any supporting evidence. In a June 20th interview on that person's show, the last time I mentioned his name on my platform, I got in a lot of trouble. The explosive claim was made in the context of a larger discussion of how that party is spending huge sums of money to buy politicians, media, and influence in countries like Australia and Italy. For those of you who are aware of what happened to Cardinal Pell, that should cause your ears to perk up. It's worth reminding you. Vigano was tasked with investigating Vatican's finances. And he was finding millions and millions of dollars hidden away in private little accounts for unspecified purposes. To the point where he was summoned by Benedict XVI and sent to become the papal nuncio to the United States for, as Vigano described it in one place, his own safety. The person who followed him in that job was Cardinal George Pell. Cardinal Pell started finding the same kinds of money in the same kinds of places. And then he went to do some private function in Australia, and money was mysteriously transferred from the Vatican to Australia and then to an unknown person. And then suddenly, Cardinal Pell's legal problems began. And then he was eventually exonerated by the courts, eventually, after years. And what happened to him? He went to Rome for a surgery. And the condition he was in, he passed away in that surgery, in a very routine surgery, which can happen to older people. But the condition he was in, reportedly, was meant to send a message. The following person after Cardinal Pell was Cardinal Becciu, who appeared to go along, discovered the same kind of financial things, but instead decided he wanted to kind of get in on the action from the appearance of it, or at least was confronted and offered to be allowed to get in on the action, and later on became the fall guy for this. Finances are at the heart of this. 2014, the CPC Inside made the decision. Every year they want $2 billion to pay the Vatican to influence Vatican policy about China and Vatican. Regarding the Christian and Catholic mistreatment, they want the Vatican to shut up, to follow the CPC about religion, the policy, that disaster. These expenditures, according to previous statements by him, are part of a larger strategy to achieve worldwide hegemony that goes by the initials BGY. The initials BGY stand for blue, control over the internet, gold, buying influence with money, and yellow, seducing key people with sins of the flesh. He said Saturday that the party in pursuit of hegemony has been investing a fixed percentage of trade earnings with foreign countries into the BGY program since 2014. The whole goal is to compromise, co-opt, and control as many nation states as possible, especially its key competitor, the U.S. To this end, he says the BGY quota for the U.S. and other countries, which started at 1%, has been increasing from 1% to 5% over the years. That is a whole other can of worms to go down. Does any of this surprise you? And this goes back to that letter at the beginning. They're asking essentially, Liz Yore, Michael Matt, John Henry Weston are asking for the U.S. government, DOJ and its auditors, to investigate not the church, because they don't have any authority to do that. They want them to investigate the U.S. agencies and their behavior with the church, which they do have the authority to investigate. And it could happen, depending how far down the rabbit hole they're really willing to go to try to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. And it's unfortunate that the church Christ founded on the rock of Peter, outside of which there is no salvation, has to be subject to this. But I'll remind you, Leo XIII reportedly had his vision, if you want to call it that, of a conversation between the devil and our Lord, and the devil bragging he could destroy the church Christ founded on the rock of Peter if he only had a century to do it. Christ reportedly told him, you will have the time, you will have the power. And when you think about that, think about the third secret of Fatima. We don't know when that period started, but it had to have started by now. When you hear about the third secret of Fatima and why it was never released, I have a video on that coming for you from a source who many of you like, about why it was never released. Think about all the ways that Satan has waged war on the church. Do not leave it. Do not walk away from the faith. If you have to drive a long distance to get to a traditional mass, do it. Stay close to the sacraments. Live the best Catholic life you can. Grow in holiness. But don't leave the church. And don't put too much hope on a conclave coming that will restore things. Because the same actors who were there, either they or their essentially spiritual children, are in the background and still active in things. All right, folks. Craig Ganell says not authority not to investigate the horrible things against the most young. Oh, they have that's criminal statute stuff. But we're talking about the Vatican. People are expecting Elon Musk's guys to go show up at the Vatican to demand access to servers and things. That's not going to happen. Let's take a look here in the live chat. As Mark Becker says, when you lose your faith, money is the only thing that matters. That is true. That is true. Or some other material thing. Maybe it's not money, but it's maybe something else. But when you lose your faith, the material is all you care about. And when you read those bishops' letters on this, and they're frothing at them out statements, and the bizarre articles from America Magazine, the National Catholic Reporter, and even some of the better bishops coming down on the side of the material on this, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious where we are. All right, folks. Curious what you think about this, and let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Catholics need the Vatican, need to clean up their acts when it comes to money. Well, I mean, again, this is why I tell you, say it again, the book, Malachi Martin's book, Vatican, is instructive here. And I found out that it's available on Amazon now. And new editions of it are available on Amazon. The publisher has decided to make those available. So you can buy Malachi Martin's book, Vatican, which goes over the history of the financial side of these things. It is written in the same way Windswept House is, which is faction, meaning he's telling it as a story. Very, very little is embellished in it, though. You can go look up the events in it. And he changes the names of people, but it's not exactly the most creative. The Polish Pope, I wonder who he's talking about there, right? You go read that, and you'll understand. In fact, I think that's even available in audiobook form, so go check that out if that works better for you. All right, folks. This is one of those topics that can cause a lot of consternation for people. So, again, please pray for everybody we spoke about here in the broadcast today. Salvation of souls is the first law of the church. We all have our duty regarding that. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.